Good morning. Welcome to the Point. Even as lawmakers in Lansing are trying to hammer out a budget for this year and next, other legislators are looking to solve problems that they think are happening right now. One such lawmaker is an Ottawa County Republican representative, Jim Lilly, and he talks about ways he's trying to preserve beaches and other areas from eroding further during these rising waters. Representative, this conversation comes at an interesting time because the last time you and I talked, it was at a committee where you were testifying on behalf of a bill that you had introduced, part of a number of different bills from other representatives, dealing with the continuing problem that we have of rising water. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. But your bill just this past week was passed out of committee. Tell me about what your specific bill would mean in terms of letting local municipalities have some input on how waterways are used in their area.
Sure. So really what we're trying to do is truncate the existing permanent water control zone sort of process. This concept that communities go through to change no wake zones on bodies of water within them. That process now can take up to 2 years to complete, and we're in sort of an emergency high water situation now, and so we really need a solution that's more temporary in nature, giving communities time to deal with sort of any permanent changes that are needed, but sort of recognizing that there's going to come a point where these water levels recede, and we want to be ready to respond where boating and recreation can really return to normal levels on these bodies of water, and we want that to be able to happen quickly as well. And so what these bills really do is they provide a short-term emergency type solution for communities to utilize, while they have longer-term planning discussions about what those no wake zones are going to look like within their communities.
So when you talk about the terms, and I will get this wrong, but you will correct me, your legislation would be the one that is the most immediate for the 2-week period of time, is that right?
So actually that's not right.
But
again, I know there's thousands of bills in the legislature, right. Rick, so no worries on that. But no, I've combined my bill, which is essentially a truncated process of the permanent water control zone changes, which really moves that timeline into an approval of under a month. There is another package of bills, 5401, 5402, that I've sort of packaged with my bill that provide a 14-day sort of emergency situation. And that can be implemented by like an emergency manager or a sheriff or the DNR on a very short-term basis. My process again, much more mirrors the permanent process, just with a truncated approval process. And so, but I think those bills working together provide a very comprehensive solution for the short-term nature of this. And I'm really proud of the work that I've done with the DNR on this too, and sort of bringing them along and helping them understand the issues that my community is facing. And in that process, we actually found that there is an opportunity in the current permanent water control zone rules to establish a tiered no wake zone. So communities could establish a permanent no wake zone based on a high water level and pair that with a more normalized no wake zone based on more normal water levels. And so I think for communities to have that option, knowing that now they have some time to work through that under Representative Eisen's bills and my bill, that they can use that time to put in place a longer term solution that will work for that community in the long run.
And the DNR, and there were some questions, I mean, the DNR is still going to have an input in this. It's not like you're going around them, because obviously they are the experts when it comes to this. This is just about more immediate relief in a circumstance that we're seeing now after decades of low water levels. Now we have these extreme high water levels, and the wake zones could potentially create some real problems of erosion and other things.
They really could, and yes, the DNR is still very much involved, particularly in my bill. Again, we're not taking them out of the process, we're just in a way requiring them to respond faster by requiring local communities to submit some information in a package in a timely fashion. And we have streamlined that process in a way that I think will benefit local communities, but at the same time, the DNR recognizes we do have to streamline that process, and so they're willing to put some onus on them to make sure that happens. But again, long term, I mean, I think that this is really important for communities. I think that this will provide them the flexibility that they need to ensure that property isn't damaged. And it's not just about individual homeowners either, Rick. I mean, a lot of these communities have infrastructure along these areas, whether it's water and sewer or roads. To the extent that we can limit the amount of damage from wakes to that's money that communities are going to save in the long run.
So I always like to talk about the process because people sometimes are unsure. So the committee process is where you come, you testify, you have conversations. The committee either asks you to come back and testify, which they did in this case. You went back a second time after talking with some of the stakeholders that had some questions, and that's always fair because you have that conversation. Now you've passed out of the House committee. We'll go to the full House, and if you're successful there, moves to the Senate. Is this something that you, and I know you can't second guess how quickly it moves on the agenda, but is this something that could be passed with immediate effect and actually have impact in this coming voting season?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Rick. I hope that that's the case. So we actually have really fast-tracked this particular piece of legislation. We took our time in the initial committee, really made sure we had all stakeholders on board. Everybody had a chance to come in and testify. You know, we've even got the boating industry in favor of this at this point. Again, recognizing that the last thing they want is to have a lot of wakes creating issues on these inland waterways, which cause communities to rethink permanently, you know, what their recreation looks like on those bodies of water. And so we've really accelerated that process. We actually have it through Ways and Means already. And you know, during actually this week, we've actually already passed it out of the House. We did that on Tuesday. So it's moved fast. It's been referred to committee over on the Senate side. I've done what I can to ensure we can get a hearing quickly over there. And again, by working with the department, I'm optimistic that the governor will ultimately be supportive of this legislation as well. And I think in the era of divided government, having those conversations with the department really early on things is really important. And this is certainly one of those examples where we've brought everybody together early to make sure that there really aren't any significant concerns so we can fast track the process. I'm hopeful that we can get this done before the end of March. Which really puts us in a pretty good spot for communities to be able to utilize this tool in 2020 here.
You bring up an interesting point, Ways and Means. This is new. Now, we've known about it on the federal level for years, but in an interesting turn, a Ways and Means Committee established. You're part of that?
I am.
And because of that, this bill and many others kind of go there to get vetted before they go to the House floor, which I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, may make the amount of time on the House floor a little less since they already come out with, if you will, a secondary recommendation. You've already got the committee, and now that's gone through Ways and Means. Tell me how that process works.
Sure. So, you know, if I go back to sort of thinking, you know, in the last cycle and in my first term in the House, there were a lot of bills that started collecting on the floor. You know, things would pass out of committee on party line votes or with a lot of stakeholder opposition, or the department opposed, and things would just languish on the floor. Bills would sit there for months or even years without a hearing. And what we'd always heard from a leadership perspective is that, you know, the Senate is really the more deliberative body. And we thought to ourselves, well, why is that? Why does it have to be that way? We're very thoughtful too here on the House side of things. And so we decided to put in place a process of the Ways and Means process where basically many of the lower policies committees are reporting bills to that Ways and Means Committee. And essentially, you could think of it almost as a holding pen for bills before they go to the floor. And what that allows is, again, continued stakeholder input, continued opportunity for testimony and transparency in the process, and it allows us to, again, engage the department in a meaningful way, because sometimes not everyone is sure if a bill is actually even going to pass out of committee or get a hearing, and so they don't always engage right away. What this creates is a process where if that necessarily hasn't happened, it does provide an additional vetting opportunity for that. And I think it's something that's working very well. You know, we run that committee where if we don't see any opposition in the lower committee, if things come out unanimously, we typically have those things up on a Tuesday agenda and we're moving them through very quickly. But then there are other bills that have significant opposition or require some additional work. And you know, we put those up on a Wednesday or Thursday. We talk about them and look to make some changes and hopefully get them to a point that when we get them to the floor, we can move them quickly.
When you think about the change in that process from your first term to now, give me a percentage of change in the way it looks, because I can attest to the fact that bills will be read in and then you never hear anything about them, and sometimes they die at the end of a session, or sometimes they're part of those packages that people are voting in a huge flurry at the end of a session sometimes. I suggest maybe without having full idea of what they're voting on. Does this change that process?
I think it does. I mean, it's tough to tell in a vacuum what really makes the difference.
And it's new.
It's new, and we're in the area of divided government, so there's just less bills overall. But look, at the end of the day, I did not come to Lansing to grow government. The fact that we're running less bills, I don't think is a bad thing. I think that's actually a good thing for Michigan citizens and for Michigan businesses. But I do think that it dramatically changes the way the process operates, and I think it makes it much more deliberative, because again, all of these bills are having changes happen in the committee process as opposed to on the floor. So these committee members are engaging with stakeholders and their constituents in a more meaningful way on the bills that are in front of them, as opposed to a bill that makes it to the floor that there's a lot of controversy on, and all of a sudden you have lobbyists and constituents and all kinds of folks reaching out to try to contact members about a bill, and they're trying to get them to take a position based on like a 1 or 2 minute conversation on the tiles. And that's just not a very effective way to do policy. And things, I think the Ways and Means process has really changed the way that works. And a lot of those conversations are happening in committee. They're happening here in our offices, where they can be more drawn out, and we can ask questions and we can think about things and then come back. And I think that's how the process was really meant to work. And I think it's really good for Michigan. Ultimately, lobbyists will stand out in the hallway, and you've seen this, where there's a controversial issue and you have 100 lobbyists out there pulling members out to talk to them about the issue. And under the Ways and Means process, a lot of that has gone away, because we're encouraging those folks to connect earlier, because they know, look, if this bill has come out of the lower committee and it's in Ways and Means, it's probably going to move. We should probably work to get some input into this.
As the representative pointed out, the Ways and Means Committee is new this year. To see how it really works will take some time, but up to now, it's getting high marks. When we come back, we'll talk about legislation dealing with elections. It's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. One of the more enjoyable things we get to do here on the show is introduce you to lawmakers you may not have yet met. One such lawmaker is Democrat Leslie Love. She is a Detroit representative, and she is in her third term. Currently, she's working on legislation that deals with some of the election of 2018. She'll explain about that later, but first, something about her. Representative, before we get to a couple of bills that I think are very timely and deal with elections, let's talk about you a little bit, because you'll be new to some of our viewers. You're in your third term in the State House.
That's correct.
So tell me a little bit about how you got to this point in your career.
Well, before being elected to state representative, I was a professor at Marygrove College and the director of theater operations for 13 years. And I had a wonderful tenure there at the college. But during that time, and even before then, I was always politically engaged. Both of my parents were union members, and so advocacy, the issues around working class people had just been a part of my culture growing up. And so when I became a teenager and registered to vote, I just got involved in campaigns. Whether it was a mayor, a city council person, or a governor, I just helped out. And people noticed, and I was very active in my congressional district too, and people noticed that, and they said, "You're really good. Have you ever thought about running?" And I thought, no, no, that's not something. I always imagined myself more of that character that was on Spin City. It's a television show that happened a long time ago. Do you remember that?
I do.
Spin City, that Michael J. Fox character, the smart person behind the mayor or behind the elected official that really had things going on. That's where I imagined my space being. But as time came, I did feel like there was an opportunity and a need for my voice to be a part of the conversation. I saw what was happening in district, in my community, and across the state, and I wanted to figure out how can we help address some of the issues of illiteracy, funding for our public school systems. How do we make sure mothers bring their children into this world full term? How do we end poverty? What do we do about returning citizens? And so many, what do we do about the overproliferation of drugs in our community? And I wanted to be at the table to figure out what's going on here and how do we solve those problems. So I ran for office, and here I am.
Well, that is a big plate full of things to do. Talk to me a little bit about your district, because when you say Detroit, that's pretty generic, but you have a very
Right.
specific district.
Detroit is huge. So I represent a portion of the northwest end of Detroit. I'm to the north, 8 miles, 7 miles to the south. On my eastern border is Meyer, and I go all the way west to Inkster Road, which passes through Retford Township, and I represent all of Retford Township. So my district is pretty unique, I think, in that I have a portion of the largest city in the state, and also a township. And they have two very different forms of government. We have a supervisor in the township and a board of trustees, and then we have a very strong mayor in the city of Detroit and the city council. So I get to have very interesting conversations in this and get really great perspective.
You talked about you thinking of yourself as being that person behind the person, but now 5 years into this, you have been the person. What has it been that has surprised you the most about being in this position? Because people have told me before, and I have not done it, but I take them at their word that even though you are going through orientation, people are helping you, that first year can be like drinking from a fire hose. And even today, watching you trying to keep your schedule, juggling from a speaking engagement you just came to this interview, to your next event. You said you live in 30-minute increments. Those are the things you do. What's been the big surprise about this?
Wow, how absolutely demanding. When you do this work and you're really trying to figure out how to solve problems, when you're working on policy, how much time I can spend in Lansing just trying to deal with the policy. I left a conversation with regional transportation people. I've been talking about regional transportation and funding transportation and infrastructure since before I arrived here. And we're still having those conversations. And I think it was last week, a member introduced a bill. I said, where did this bill come from? And so we're scrambling, trying to find out what he's doing, because it's not in my committee. It's not an appropriations focused bill, but it's a policy bill. And so that, I think, is a surprise, just how time consuming it is, and how social media driven our culture is, and they want to hear from us. I'm like, tweet me, text me, Facebook, Instagram, ghost me. And I'm like, but I'm working really hard on this. And so trying to find that balance of letting people know this is what I'm doing, at the same time. And so I have worked really hard to be equally in the district as I am here. And I think the constituents back home would say somehow, and it's just by pure sacrificing any personal life that I thought I could have, to be sure to make sure my residents know me and know the work that I'm doing on their behalf.
You have tandem bills that have been introduced, and I think they are very timely because we are in the run-up to a big presidential primary. And of course, we've got the primaries coming up in August, and we've got the general election. And because of new rules that were passed by the people of Michigan, we have what is now no reason absentee voting, which, while I don't have any firm numbers, anecdotally, I would suggest means a whole heck of a lot more absentee ballots. And you may have a better handle on actual numbers. But tell me what your first bill would do, because I think what people may not know is that those absentee ballots are cast, they are sent back to the clerk, and then they sit there. They aren't dealt with in any meaningful way until election day.
Right.
Your bill would change that partially.
Right. So we're excited that the citizens passed the Proposal 3 that allowed for them to have more access to vote, and that no reason absentee voting is allowed. But what we failed to do on the state level is balance that equation so that our clerks now can respond to this new way that voters are going to interface and cast their vote. So we've always had absentee voters. But now with this and the encouragement of everybody go absentee vote, the method to process those ballots is it takes a village, literally. And so let me give you an example. In the city of Detroit, we have some 503 precincts and 134 counting boards. Counting boards are what we call the place where you take absentee ballots and they get processed and tabulated. If we fully staffed all 134 of those counting boards with inspectors, including supervisors, that's over 560 people we need processing ballots on one day. That's a nice small corporation. And so clerks across the state would have to, but no one like the enormous responsibility of the clerk for the city of Detroit would have to find those people who will be sequestered, locked in a room for a minimum of 13 hours, no cell phone, no real contact with anyone outside of that location, to process and tabulate ballots. That's a lot to ask one of our citizens who come to do this and participate in democracy. And it's also a great challenge for our clerks to figure out how to train, prepare, and then get there for that one day. So my first bill is a bill that would allow clerks to process ballots earlier. So for example, that could mean that you just open the ballot and flatten it out. And I know this because I've lived it, and I'm involved in this legislation because I've worked at the poll. I'm in training to work the canvass boards. So when those ballots been in that secret envelope for weeks or whatever, and sometimes they get stuck through the tabulator. So we need to flatten them out. So maybe that's a machine that helps us flatten those ballots out so they're not jammed and now the entire counting board is paused for 30 minutes or whatever. And I have a bill for that to ask for an appropriation for more equipment. So there's a process, and there is quite an intensive process as we handle those absentee ballots. And so I just want to make sure that we can do that efficiently, timely, and correctly.
Nobody's fault, but as you point out, this is maybe one of those unintended consequences of trying to get to make voting more accessible to people all across the state. So as this moves along, obviously that's not going to be in place for the presidential primary.
Right.
But
hopefully this year.
Yeah. But you think you could get it in place by November?
I think if we are determined, the legislature is an interesting place, right? When we want something to move, we can move it. And then when we don't, they really come up with barriers to block it. And so I think there is an appetite. There's definitely on both sides of the aisle, we recognize we need to do something about this. This is a problem. Having a former Secretary of State in the Senate helps have this conversation. We have similar bills. Her method is slightly different than mine, but the objective is the same. So there's a will. We just have to see if they're able to, the leadership is willing to do that.
And you're talking about former Secretary of State, now Senator Ruth Johnson, over in the Senate finally. Do we have a sense of what will happen with absentee ballots in this term? Do the clerks think that this just continues to grow? I mean, this is one of the really first big tests, and by the time we get to November, that will be a huge test. But again, I said at the beginning, I don't know the numbers, but anecdotally, I would guess that there are going to be a lot more, and that number may continue to grow when people take advantage of an easier way to vote than standing in line.
It's not just the volume. It is also in the law the same day registration and voting. So if it's my first time ever, say I'm going to show up, I want to register to vote and vote in this election. It's logistics and moving those things from that location to a counting board so that ballot can be processed and tabulated. That's a part of that. It's not just, we're happy, we'll take all, I think clerks will, we're glad that people are voting, but we also want to make sure that you get a result and that you get an accurate count, and we do it efficiently. Because people want it like popcorn. In 3 minutes, we want it now. I'm sorry. And so it won't be probably that quick, but also be mindful for the hundreds of folks who come and work the counting boards or who work at the polling location. So I think clerks are sensitive to the voter and everyone who makes election day possible. And sometimes we forget about that side.
As we heard both of the legislators say, they hope that the legislation they're working on right now can go into place relatively soon. In the case of Representative Love, she wants those new election guidelines in place by November of this year. And for Representative Lilly, he would like his new wake restrictions in place in time for this boating season. It's hard to know if they can happen that quickly, particularly, as we pointed out at the beginning of the show, there's still a lot of heavy lifting to do with the budget. But we'll keep watching them both. And we'll have a final note when we return to The Point. So looking beyond the state, this week it's the Super Tuesday Democratic presidential primary. That may well change the field before the next week when they all head here to Michigan. We know there are new voting rules. We know people have already been voting absentee. But what will Michigan's Democratic primary look like? We'll be following that right up to March 10th, and of course, we'll be following the election all the way to November. We'll see you next week. To the Point.